What you combine together makes such a huge difference after a workout. It's not like, oh, I finished my workout, I need to give my body protein. Yes, that's true, but the reality is that protein synthesis stays elevated for 24 plus hours. You don't need to be getting all your protein in right after your workout. Since protein synthesis is elevated for such a long period of time, it really comes down to getting enough protein over the following 24 hours after a workout. And what you're trying to aim for is getting enough protein to compensate for the muscle protein breakdown that occurred as a result of a workout. That being said, different workouts have different stimulus, right? Or require a different stimulus, I should say. Different workouts are going to trigger different metabolic demand, and we can tailor our post-workout nutrition and combinations accordingly. So I've broken this video down into 3 categories. The category for hard workout with a long training session that's much more like resistance train, like what you should eat there. Then also a post-workout combination for people that are following a lower carb protocol where it's kind of confusing with what sort of carbs or food to have post-workout in the first place. And then also one that's geared more towards recovery. Someone that's maybe not trying to build a bunch of muscle, you just don't want to get sore and you just want to feel good because you're weight training or exercising for the health benefit. So let's go ahead and dive in. So this first category, if you are doing a longer training session where you are really depleting muscle glycogen, there is a time and a place for a more high glycemic post-workout meal. Ordinarily, I don't condone having a bunch of high glycemic carbohydrates, right? Where you'd spike your blood glucose very high. However, after a workout is a pretty controlled period of time in which you can probably get away with it. And it begs the question, if spiking our glucose is bad, then is it worse to have a high spike in glucose and then come down and be within range the rest of the day? Or is it worse to have your glucose moderately high at an even level all day, right? I would say that nice periods of time where you allocate carbohydrates, where you do get one very distinct spike that is in control, is probably better. You might spike really high, but at least you're controlling it and coming down. And let me explain how this would work. So after a longer training session, if you had something high glycemic, in theory, you are allowing for more nutrients to get into a cell. You are allowing for more carbohydrates to flood back into the cell, to flood back into the muscle to replenish muscle glycogen. Well, you have to kind of work in tandem with the right protein. Okay, what I mean by this is if you were to have, let's say, a chicken breast right after a workout alongside a high glycemic carbohydrate, that chicken breast is going to do what it's supposed to do for a glycemic response, and it's going to slow down and attenuate that glucose response. So then, instead of getting that big spike in glucose that would trigger you to be recovered, you would actually get a gentle bell curve, which is what we want overall for glycemic control, but not necessarily to bombard our cells with glucose right after a workout, right? So what I do suggest in this particular case, this is where having something like a whey protein shake, a protein shake in general really, but a whey protein shake really spikes insulin and glucagon high. And it absorbs so fast that you're going to have a little bit more of a spike alongside it when you have carbohydrates. So this combination would be something like a whey protein shake of approximately 30 to 35 grams alongside one of 2 things. Either a baked potato that is still hot, because when you bake a potato, the starch chains actually separate because the heat ends up causing them to separate. That means the starch chain that is made up of glucose molecules now is individual glucose molecules. So these individual glucose molecules end up absorbing really fast. Another situation that works well with that is going to be a rice cake. I'm more of a fan of a baked potato because I'm not the biggest fan of grains for some reason. They just don't feel great for me. But with a rice cake, it's the same theory. The starch chains are then puffed, and that means that you're going to have individual glucose molecules. Alongside this, I usually recommend having like a half a cup of fruit, in this particular case, not berries. Something like melon or maybe even kiwi, something that's relatively high in fructose, but doesn't have the amylase inhibitors, which I'll talk about in a second. What the fruit is going to do is it's going to allow you to restore carbohydrates from a different pathway, a GLUT5 pathway versus a GLUT4 pathway. Long story long, basically you're absorbing carbohydrates via two different pathways. One's gonna help restore liver glycogen, one's gonna help restore muscle glycogen a little bit more. Very colloquial way of putting it. But essentially it's a very quick wham bam, thank you ma'am, protein in fast, insulin spikes, glucagon spikes, insulin and glucose spike in time just to absorb. Okay. Now we got to move into the next category. This is what if you're doing low carb, right? If you're keto, you don't want to be spiking your glucose super high and kicking yourself out of ketosis. That makes perfect sense. You wouldn't want to do that. So in this case, it becomes a little bit different. You want to focus more on how you can delay that carbohydrate response, where you're still able to do what's called a targeted ketogenic protocol, where you absorb carbohydrates at the right time, at the right place, without necessarily kicking you out of ketosis. By the way, I put a link down below for Thrive Market. Thrive Market has a bunch of different keto options. They have like keto whey protein shakes and all kinds of stuff that might work really, really well in this particular situation. I'll explain in more detail, but there's a link down below. It'll save you 30% off your first order. Now, you don't have to get shakes or whatever. You can get whatever you want. It's an online grocery store, and everything gets delivered to your doorsteps. It's super easy. You go online, you use that link down below. Make sure you use it. That's 30% off your whole grocery order. So if you're stocking up, that's a lot of moolah you could save. So use that link down below, and then you sort by diet type, keto, fasting, paleo, or if you are not and you just want to get good tasting stuff, you can do that too. And then it gets delivered to your doorstep, and that's it. Super easy. So again, that link is down below, and that also gets you a free $50 gift when you use that link. So check them out down below. So what I would recommend as like a perfect post-workout sort of lower carb meal is going to be still generally either a plant-based protein or a whey protein isolate, okay? That's totally your prerogative there. There's pros and cons to each, but that's not the point. Quick absorbing protein, okay? You could also do something like a chicken breast in this particular case. Since we are not manipulating the insulin spike, we do not have to worry quite so much about slower carbohydrate absorption. What we are focusing on here more is keeping the carbohydrate absorption very controlled so that your body can still produce ketones. So what I usually recommend is whey or plant-based protein, whatever you want to do, plus 1 scoop or about 5 grams of MCT oil powder. Okay, you don't have to use powder, you could use straight up oil if you wanted to. The reason I want to do this is because if you are already in a lower carb state, your body's gonna be able to utilize those MCTs to create ketones faster. So you can potentially concurrently have a little bit of a glucose spike along with a little bit of a ketone formation occurring within the liver if you time it properly. So usually a little bit of whey with a little bit of MCT. And in this case, if you wanna add carbs into the mix, I would recommend 4 or 5 ounces of a cold potato. Not raw, but one that you have heated and then refrigerated to let cool. This turns it into what is called a retrograded starch, and it actually becomes a resistant starch where you'll still be able to absorb some carbohydrates in the way of muscle glycogen, but you'll also be able to get a resistant starch that feeds the gut microbiome. So you get some carbs that are not necessarily going to heavily kick you out of keto, and if they do, it's minuscule and it's short. And an optional thing you could add in the mix would be like a half a cup of berries. The berries are an amylase inhibitor, specifically raspberries. That means they're gonna slow the digestion of those carbs even more, okay? So now you're getting like a sustained, really slow drip of carbohydrates that probably isn't going to affect your blood glucose so much that it kicks you out of keto. And if it does, once again, it's short, okay? So very interesting stuff there. And again, that's called a targeted ketogenic approach, and that would be the only time of day you'd have carbohydrates, is right after your workout when your body can suck it up into the muscle without it affecting ketone formation or ketogenesis within the liver. Okay, now we move into an interesting one for recovery or for people over 50. Now, one of the things that I recommend, people over 50, if you look at the literature, need more protein. The rate of muscle protein breakdown increases over age 40, really, but especially over age 50 and 60. So as muscle protein breakdown increases, you need more protein intake to actually allow for muscle protein synthesis. Muscle protein synthesis also slows down and becomes less efficient. So in the other categories, I would usually say 30, 35 grams of protein, maybe even 25. For people over 50, I would say 35 to 40. Okay, a little bit more in that way just to kind of help get that muscle protein synthesis going. I highly, highly, highly recommend in this case you either still go for the whey protein, but even better, go for a lean fish with a small amount of fat. Okay, now why is this? Well, if you're going to get something like a sockeye salmon, you're talking fat that's coming from omega-3s. Some of the only evidence that has been out there to attenuate delayed onset muscle soreness has been associated with hydration and omega-3s. The jury is really still out on what causes DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. It's confusing, it's really wild. We don't really know 100% what's going on. So with that, omega-3s seem to have an effect at an inflammatory level to modulate that delayed onset muscle soreness. However, you don't want to have copious amounts. You don't want to pump fish oil pills because you don't want to crush inflammation, because the inflammation is what is allowing you to recover. But you want just enough that's coming from a good steady source. Additionally, the pigment, that red pigment in salmon, is called astaxanthin. Okay, that is a powerful antioxidant that might actually allow you to utilize the protein a little bit better and help modulate that stress response and again, modulate the soreness. Now with this, I would recommend similar carbohydrates as what I recommended before. I would say something like a baked potato alongside, in this case, some berries. As we get older, we do have to understand that we've developed more insulin resistance as we get older. Not a lot of ways around it. Some of it comes from a decrease in muscle mass. Some of it comes from mitochondrial dysfunction that just occurs as we age. So I would reduce the amount of carbohydrates probably down to like 25 to 30 grams. And if you have it by having a mix of maybe a baked potato and berries, you can reduce some of that glycemic impact. Now, one thing that I want to end on that's good for all categories, very, very important piece. There is something called metabolic gridlock. So when you start overeating in one sitting, you're probably not going to post-workout, but let's say you finished a workout and you were so hungry, you went to Chipotle and you got 2 burritos. That would probably send you into what is called metabolic gridlock. Okay, essentially, the systems that are required to process glucose at a cellular level are antagonistic to the systems that process fat at a cellular level. The body ideally wants to run on one fuel at a time, and in small amounts, it can handle fats and carbs, but in large amounts, in the sake of overfeeding, it cannot handle both. So you end up with this mitochondrial gridlock, and it's much like traffic going down a freeway. If you have plenty of space in between cars, because there's enough time to deal with it, fats, carbs, fats, carbs, fats, carbs, things can shuffle out of the way if a cat runs in front of the car, right? There's enough space. But if you start hammering fats, carbs, fats, carbs, fats, carbs, and you have a bunch of cars going 75 miles an hour down the freeway with 6 inches from bumper to bumper, that cat's not going to stand a chance running out in the road, right? No one's going to be able to mitigate the issue. They can't dodge it. Same sort of analogy is happening inside our bodies. So keep the fats out of the equation until the next meal. It should be lean, it should be clean, it should be protein, and the right glycemic index of carbohydrates. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.